Welcome, everyone, to the call. I hope you're having a great Sunday. Today we're going to be talking about the interplay between identity and spiritual awareness. There's a riddle to identity, and there is a difference between what we call personality and our authentic nature. So let's just begin by first defining what we mean by personality. Personality is that collection of characteristics unique to a given individual, her or his particular assemblage of tendencies, tastes, aptitudes, and acculturations, which come to form their unique shape, their profile, in the teeming landscape of other personalities who are struggling to be seen and heard. By definition, personality sets us apart, providing human beings with a sense of singularity, this stabilizing belief in our inalienable selfhood. This process of individuation begins very early, of course, and it continues throughout our lifetime. It combines built-in factors of nature, the defining qualities we're born with, including physical type and psychological temperament, with the influences of nurture, those qualities that are influenced by demands in our environment. According to psychologists, roughly half of our personality is due to inborn factors and half to the environment in which we live. When you add to this nature-nurture combination the impact of experience, what life does to us and how we adapt to circumstances, you get the general outline, the general ingredients of personality, this hardening of an idea of self. The personality is an ongoing work in progress, though. It's like a papier-mâché that we keep adding layers onto, or like a costume that we create for a particular character that we choose to portray in the world. The costume morphs and bends in response to the plot in which we find ourselves, but is always also in some way a cover-up, a mask that we use to navigate life with other people. Now, the theatrical metaphor is actually useful for understanding the relationship between personality and our authentic self. When an actor prepares for a role, she selects the costume that best conveys the qualities of her character. She chooses not only her external wardrobe, but also the voice, the movements, the feeling tone, the style that form the impression that she wishes to make, the figure she wishes to cut on stage for maximum impact in her given role. In areas where her built-in features align with the role, she'll connect with the part quite naturally. Where they contradict or conflict with the character, she'll need to compensate as best she can. For example, I once saw a 6-foot-tall actress give a tour de force performance as a tiny old woman. But to do this successfully, she had to hunch over at a 60-degree angle to the ground, hang her head, slump her shoulders, and shrink her very presence to fit the part. She was remarkably believable in the impersonation, but afterwards she told an interviewer that playing the role was hell on her body, and it was nothing that she would ever try again. Pretending to be so much smaller than she was a major strain that left her feeling crippled afterward. And it reminded me of the pain of a student of mine who was this beautiful, statuesque woman who described her lifelong struggle not to be as big as she was, to be less noticeable, to be less powerful, to be less of a threat to the people in her life who pressured her to just fit in. And as a consequence, she had shrunk to fit expectations. She'd avoided her strength. She had shirked opportunities to stand out. And she lived with a permanent crick in her neck that mirrored the contraction of her individual spirit. Every role limits us by definition, and life is predicated on roles. Modern life more complicatedly than ever. You have the public personality, the family personality, the online personality or personalities, depending on which sites you're appearing on. You have the workplace personality, you have the spiritual personality, and so on. Unless we learn to integrate our roles and navigate them with some grace, our lives can become fractured, caught in the rigidity of one role or another, which decreases our ability to evolve. For each of us, this is the key challenge, the ability to evolve within our roles. the willingness not to attach to any of them and to remain grounded in our own true nature, that stillness and silence at the core of our being. This centeredness allows us to move in and out of roles in our life like light that's refracting through different lenses. Each role, each lens is an aspect of our being. It's a fraction of the prism, but it's never the whole of the original light. As long as we understand that, we can inhabit our roles mindfully and freely and without excessive attachment, being aware of who we are. But this awareness is also a work in progress. It's a tug of war between using our masks skillfully and being trapped or used by them. That goes a long way toward explaining how it is that good people can do such terrible things by blaming their behavior on their role. You hear this all the time. I was just doing my job. I was just following orders. As if claiming that the role made you do it absolves a person of responsibility. Of course, roles can be used for the good as well. Think of doctors, or cops, or teachers, or social leaders. Situations in which one's role increases courage and selflessness. Yet even those who played heroes in their lives are subject to burnout and empathic distress when they mistake themselves for the part that they're playing and forget the soul they are underneath, when they become reflections of other people's needs. So roles, while unavoidable, are also a trap when we fail to recognize the gap between these self-creations and the awareness behind them that transcends and observes them. When emotion drives us to embrace a particular role vehemently, the gap between those two things becomes all but invisible. We completely mistake ourselves for our roles, particularly when driven by strong emotion. For example, I know a woman who fell madly in love with a divorcee who had teenage children. Even though she had never wanted children, she married him and was determined to make their new family work. She threw herself into the job of becoming a model step-parent, lavishing attention on these children, doing the very best she could, and in return getting nothing but abuse. They saw her as a homewrecker, which she wasn't. They saw her as enemy number one in their family life. In spite of their incessant abuses, insulting her, rejecting her kindness, behaving more or less like little monsters, she stuck to her plans for taking the high road and loving her stepkids anyway. Hidden behind her stepmother mask, she forgot the truth of who she was, which was an independent, outspoken woman who rarely suffered fools lightly and rarely put up with emotional abuse. Like the tall actress who was playing the little old lady, she contorted herself to fit the role, and it wasn't long before the stretch began to take a serious toll. First on her body, which was suffering under the stress and making her physically ill, and then on her marriage, which took the brunt of her unacknowledged pain when she and her husband started to fight on a regular basis. Rather than admitting the truth that she couldn't continue to play this role for teenagers who were horrible to her, she blamed her husband for their behavior, and she vilified him for a situation that would have been obvious from the start had her desire to make it work, no matter what, not blinded her to reality. In the end, their marriage nearly collapsed until she was finally able to admit the obvious, that she couldn't play this role, even if she wanted to. So she gave her husband an ultimatum. She said, either make changes to the custody agreement and allow me more time without the kids, or else live half the time without your wife in the house. Well, in the end, they were actually saved by the strength of their love, of their bond, and he did intervene with the children, and they did find a way through this emotional mess. But it wouldn't have happened had she not been forced to question the part she was struggling to play and confessing the truth that she was so ashamed of. I've heard similar stories from all kinds of quarters, as you probably have. The activist who works themselves into a serious illness before admitting that they can't bear the work, an athlete who becomes a drug addict to kill the pain they refuse to acknowledge, fearing that they're going to let their teammates down, a nurse who became clinically depressed working in a pediatric oncology unit, and so on. However different their circumstances, the pattern was the same, of becoming trapped in their roles, and making themselves into somebody they longed or needed to be, sacrificing authenticity for the sake of appearance. On reflection, each of these individuals came to see the dangerous game that they were playing. The activist I just mentioned stopped working in war-torn countries. The athlete got sober, gave up competing. The oncology nurse moved to orthopedics. In each case, while the transition was tough, forcing each of these people to drop their mask and get real with who they actually are, all of them were ultimately benefited by admitting to their limitations and letting go of the heroic persona. So ask yourself, where are you trying to be a hero in your life? And how does this heroicism distort who you actually are? What roles are you playing that don't fit? What aspects of your personality are bogus and which are connected to your natural being? Are you a fragile person pretending to be tough? Are you a strong person pretending to be weak? Do you pride yourself on being selfless while covering up your genuine needs? Is the personality that you show the world an appropriate fit, or is it an exaggeration? Are you subject to a tyrannical self-image that imagines its own omnipotence? Or does your self-image tyrannize you with low expectations and fear of your own unworthiness? These are critical questions to ask ourselves in the process of becoming psychologically whole human beings. Now, from a spiritual perspective, this becomes even more paradoxical. Because in order to know this experience of wholeness and to align with that free, observing self that isn't subject to personality or roles, we must be aware that we are nobody, that we're nobody. That at our core, as spiritual beings, we are nameless, formless, and untouchable by circumstance. Even though we have individual bodies, unique manifestations in the world, when it comes to an unchanging solid self, there's no there. And this is the hardest thing for an ego to admit. Celebrating the fact that we're nobody is anathema to our pride over being a solid, dependable, worthy self. The two are not compatible. But however vigorously we try to fight off this insight about being this unchanging, this self behind circumstance, it turns out to be a huge liberation that we are nobody at the most fundamental level. It's a great liberation. When we see that, we can begin to discern between costume and content. We can recognize this obvious fact that what can be seen is not the seer. In other words, in recognizing the body, we're not the body. In recognizing our feelings, we're not our feelings. And in recognizing the veneer of personality, you cannot possibly just be that personality. And yet the majority of human beings never make the separation. The majority of us move through our lives saying, what you see is what you get. And disregard the enormity of what can't be seen. It's as if we mistake the iceberg tip for this vast, invisible breadth of what we actually are. Spiritual sages have talked about this disconnect for eons. In the non-dual tradition, they use the process of elimination to reveal what's left after we strip off our illusions. When he was asked to describe who he was, the great sage Ramana Maharshi replied, quote, "The gross body, I am not. The 5 cognitive sense organs, I am not. The organs of speech, locomotion, grasping, excretion, and procreation, I am not. The 5 vital airs, I am not. Even the mind that thinks, I am not." So the student said, well, if you are none of these, who are you? And Ramana Maharshi replied, after negating all of the above mentioned as not this, not that, the awareness that alone remains, that I am. Okay. The awareness that alone remains, that I am. And that's the great realization that distinguishes the truly wise from the rest of us. It's the secret behind all forms and appearances. That by sacrificing the illusion of being somebody and embracing the truth of being nobody, we're actually given the universe in return. We can open our eyes to the cosmos inside us. What Ralph Waldo Emerson, another very different sage, described as the infinitude of the private man. Emerson was always saying that we are a cosmos within ourselves, that every man is a god. To recognize this infinitude is our destiny as spiritual seekers. To step beyond the costume of the personality self into the transcendent awareness of being nobody. Now, far-fetched as this sounds to the egocentric mind, this infinitude, this nobodiness, it's actually quite obvious when we take the time to pay attention and do a little self-inquiry. When we step outside the matrix of habitual thoughts and assumptions and we look into the mirror of truth, we know this quite naturally and beyond any doubt. Just ask yourself honestly, are you your name? Of course you're not. If the state came along and took your name away, nothing would change in you whatsoever. Are you your body? Well, no. While biology constitutes your physical presence, it doesn't define your entirety. Things like imagination and creativity, aspiration, and spirituality. Are you your mind? Clearly not, since the mind is amorphous and forever changing. It's more of a verb than a noun, thinking, worrying, planning, remembering. Are you the sum of your relationships? Well, no again, since one can lose every emotional connection and still not cease to exist. Going down the line of self-descriptors, we can say the same of nationality and profession and every affiliation and role associated with the idea of self. After negating one label after another and failing to find one that captures you definitively, an honest person is forced to admit that at the end of the day, she or he is nobody, that you are fundamentally a no-self, that the awareness shining through your eyes and animating every cell in your body is not a somebody, but rather a something, an intelligence, a mystery, a phenomenon, an uncapturable energy that can't be seen, but which can be felt through spiritual practice. Learning to be still, to keep quiet, to observe the body-mind as it identifies with thoughts and feelings that are here one moment and gone the next. You can know this nobodiness for yourself and the freedom from the hard, heavy work of struggling to be a big someone. You can feel this lightness in the presence of enlightened individuals, people who've cut ties to their personality self. With nothing to defend, they're more transparent. Without the illusion of a fixed self-image, they're more spontaneous, they're more receptive, more open to change. Those people who are freed of this ego's deadly seriousness, love me, pay attention to me, prove to me that I'm real, they become more playful, more original, more courageous. And that's another paradox, that the clearer you are about the difference between self and personality, the more unique and colorful you become. And this is a very important point, because a lot of seekers are scared off from the idea of being nobody and the liberation from self, out of fear that they're going to become some kind of flat gray spore of a person without passion or distinctions or spice. But nothing could be further from the truth. The awakened, the enlightened are often a lot of fun and hilarious. They all have quirks and uniqueness. But they know that these appearances aren't them. They don't spend their time in the futile attempt to construct an airtight self with a monolithic story. Instead, they allow themselves to be thoughts without a thinker, as Mark Epstein wrote in his well-known book. Thoughts without a thinker, feelings without a feeler, love without a limiting lover self that meets out affection in increments and protects its own interests at every turn. We become verbs, not nouns. We become systems, not a self. And when we're free of this insecure self-image, which is always playing tit for tat, we can follow the example of the wise and discover a whole new range of ways to live and experience ourselves, our uniqueness, without imagining that this uniqueness sums up who we are. This isn't an easy process. Of course, it's not an easy process. It goes against everything that we're taught in a culture that's addicted to personality and self-definition and mistaking ourselves for how we appear. But the great news is that the more we do it, the happier we become, the more secure we become in our self-knowledge, the less insecure we grow in behavior as our need to be affirmed by others diminishes, the more we experience presence. And that is the purpose of the work that we do as seekers in our lives, regardless of the tradition we're in. We're trying to move beyond the me to the we. We're trying to see beyond the roles that we're playing and experience something essential that doesn't change. And once you're able, not, but now and then, and more frequently as you practice more and more, the less stress there is in your life, the less conflict there is, and the less there is to defend. You become much, much more open and much more porous and willing to be flexible. And then when we do that, we can be receptive. We can be present because we're not constantly being dragged down by this idea of who we are that predicates our behavior and that limits and distorts our thinking.